Hello, I'm Sophie Volk, the Chair of Comparative Literature, and I'd like to welcome you all to our annual lecture in honor of former Professor of German and Comparative Literature, Ken Weisinger. This is the first time that Comp Lit and German have partnered with Cal Performances to put on this lecture together, and I want to thank Rob Bailis for appearing in conversation with Thomas Ostermeier, and to thank Laura Abrams and Sabrina Klein for all they've done to make this happen. I'd like to spend a moment to honor Ken, and then I'll turn the floor over to Denise, who will introduce our speaker, Thomas Ostermeier, whose remarks we all look forward to. I would very much have liked to have known Ken Weisinger. He was best known for his research on Weimar classicism, and he worked in German, Latin, and Greek. He was very erudite in classical philology, literature, and music, and he was devoted to the performing arts, to theater and opera. He spent his entire career at Berkeley. He was hired while he was finishing his PhD on Hölderlin and Pindar in 1971. And he was a member of the faculty in Comp Lit in German for over 30 years, chairing the Department of Comparative Literature twice. Ken believed fervently in study abroad, and for some years directed the entire education abroad program of the University of California. He died very early, at the age of 60 in 2003. So I thought I would try to bring Ken into the room for a minute by sharing with you a brief moment in his book, The Classical Facade, a non-classical reading of Goethe's classicism, published in 1988. Ken tells us that when Goethe's elegy Ermann and Dorothea was first published in 1797, it was available in several formats, among them a deluxe edition bound in silk, and with a little knife and a pair of scissors attached to the binding as a convenience for the cutting of the pages. The poem itself was, and here I'm quoting Ken, sorry. The poem itself was thus sent into the world as one of the lovely amenities of the middle-class life it ostensibly praised. Goethe had one of these fine editions sent to Schiller, who in a rare moment of humor reported to a friend, "One hardly knows what to say when one receives poems of this kind and quality in conjunction with a knife and a pair of scissors." Ken's analysis notes that the gift of a knife and scissors seems somewhat redundant. Yet, he continues, the surface of the work, which begins to appear in the role of a facade, literally demands the tools that come packaged with the book, for a radical incision is required to get to the heart of the work. This year's Weisinger Lecture is known for his radical incision. His uncannily prescient productions teach us to cut through the facade not only of the works he mounts, but of the world around us. I turn the floor over to Denise, who will introduce Thomas Ostermeier.
Yes, thank you, Sophie, and thanks to the Department of Comparative Literature for staging this lecture this year, and a very big thank you to Cal Performances, especially Rob Bailis, and then Laura Abrams and Sabrina Klein for everything they've done to make this possible. It's a very great honor and pleasure to welcome our prominent guest from Berlin, Thomas Ostermeier. He has served as the artistic director of the legendary Berlin theater Schaubühne am Lehniner Platz since 1999. He was obviously active in theater already before that, and he is the recipient of many awards, German and European, for his theater work, which I'm not going to list to you now, but he holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Kent, I read, and this year was also awarded the Bundesverdienstkreuz, the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. The Schaubühne was a stage of cutting-edge experimentation and innovation already under the previous director, Peter Stein. I myself remember seeing some magical Rob Wilson productions there when I was still a little student. But Ostermeier has really done wonders, drawing a young audience to the theater and turning the stage into a space of engaged debate. So performances are almost always sold out. It is in fact impossible to get a ticket in Berlin. All the more we are grateful for this opportunity to see this production here in Berkeley. The Schaubühne also hosts an event called Streitraum, a monthly debate with one or more guests on a topic of current affairs, moderated by Caroline Emke, which can also be watched online, by the way. All the debates are streaming. And Sascha Waltz, whom we are going to meet next week with her dance production Körper, was a co-director during the early years of Ostermeier's tenure at Schaubühne, and I think Körper actually dates back to those days. So Ostermeier is known for his, and Sophie already alluded to this, he's known for his rereadings, reworkings of classic plays, teasing out political resonances, for example in Shakespeare, Büchner, and Ibsen. Ibsen seems to be a continuing streak, among many other authors. So after the lecture today at 8 p.m. and also tomorrow night, you will have a chance to see his production of Ibsen's An Enemy of the People at Zellerbach Hall. And poking around on YouTube, I found that this play has been on tour for the past years with performances in Istanbul, Moscow, London, Seoul, Delhi, to name just a few cities. And each of these performances is somewhat different, making connections to the specific political constellation in conversation with the audience. Since An Enemy of the People touches on questions of dissent and repression that are very close to the bone for us today, we are, of course, very curious what kinds of resonances tonight's performance will evoke. I think I can safely say that this will not just be an evening of light entertainment, but theater that sets out to involve and provoke us, the audience. But first things first, we are now looking forward to Thomas Ostermeier's lecture, or rather his conversation with Rob Bailis, who is the interim artistic director of CAL Performances, where he has led many recent initiatives, including Berkeley RADICAL, which has placed artists more directly in contact with diverse audiences and communities. Bailis has played a key role in leading CAL Performances education and community programs. And during the 2017-18 season, Bailis oversaw the production of CAL Performances' first exploratory Oakland series of performances held in unconventional and innovative venues throughout the city with international artists. So I think there's a kindred spirit. And without further ado, join me in welcoming Thomas Ostermeier.
Fantastic welcome, thank you, and thank you all for being here. In the interest of time, I'd love to really just dive right in. Since we have an audience here that is a group of Complit, or Comparative Literature, German students, some students from Oakland School for the Arts, hooray, as well as faculty and community members. I think maybe our first way in might be to really discuss your approach to text. Not everyone comes to a classic play with not just a director, but also a playwright, who is going to dramaturg along with you a pathway into a vision of the work and taking something that is sort of a canonical text and reimagining it in a new frame for a new day. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, even more generally, maybe your working relationship with Marius, but also your specific approach to Enemy of the People.
Thank you for having me. Thank thanks for your interest in my work. Actually, when I look at you looking at me, I feel a bit odd because there's so much difference in how people approach and look at theater between Berlin and I would say the rest of the world. So if you consider me being a director who has a radical, let's say, approach on canonical texts, you don't know the Berlin theater landscape.
Absolutely true.
Because in the frame of the Berlin theater landscape, I'm considered to be a very text-obeying director and very much listening to the writer, and some do even say I'm a very conservative director. While when I come here, or when I work in France, or in other countries in the world, it's the opposite. They always consider me to be very free in the approach of classical texts. That is strange, and that is important for me to tell you before I try to answer your question. I'm always trying to dig deep when I approach a text, meaning and try to find out what might be the core of the text. So even though there are a lot of changes in the show you are going to see tonight, a lot of changes in I even changed characters, so there are 2 female characters in the original version of the play. I found that both of them were not very much developed, so I thought it's a good idea to put them together and make one character out of it. And many more changes in the text. I still do believe that I'm telling the story of a man who has found out something which can be called truth, and he wants to spread the truth, but he lives in a society, in a small town, where this truth he found out puts economical survival of this provincial town into danger. And I'm telling this story, and I think that's the story of the play. So when I'm respecting the core of, or the backbone of the play, I think I'm very respectful to the writer and to the play. And also I want to add, there's a beautiful version of the play by Arthur Miller, which he did in the 50s. So this is not revolutionary new to do an adaptation, and it's even been done by an American writer. So this is not necessarily something European or continental European to have an approach to a canonical text like this, to look at it, to believe that the story, the core of the story is very strong and still talking to us, but you need to do some adjustments to make it even more relevant to our times, and in this case of Enemy of the People, more relevant to my generation and to issues of a very specific group of people in Berlin, which we call hipsters.
You do too.
You do too, yeah. And I found it very interesting to think about, because the original Dr. Stockmann is quite a strange, middle-aged doctor. And I I didn't find it so interesting to talk about this kind of character. I found it more interesting to talk about this group of people, or this generation, which believes to be very tolerant, liberal, vegan, non-smoking, bicycle driving, open to the world. But then when it comes to political action, or to really stand up for your beliefs, there is a moment where, look at Occupy Wall Street, where it's not going all the way. And that's what I wanted to talk about in this version of An Enemy of the People. Also, I wanted to talk about, because it was after Occupy, but it was also after Arab Spring. It was also after Athens, Syntagma Square, Podemos in Spain, Taksim Square in Istanbul. So there was a lot going on politically from a new generation, bringing change, but then suffering again very miserable situations after this political movements, and that's what I wanted to talk about with this show.
Yeah, it's the sustaining of that effort that comes forward. Did that in some way, not to give too much away about what you'll see tonight, but did that in some way affect your decision to engage or even implicate the audience in action in the work?
This moment has become now the most significant moment of the show, and the show is known for this moment. But when we rehearsed it, and when I was working on the show, that was not the focus. And it can't be the focus, because this moment is really absolutely freestyle. So there's a lot of places in the world where we performed, I think now like 35 countries with the show. A lot of places where we performed, after the show, people were approaching me and asking me, or telling me how intelligent it is to put some extras in the audience who ask questions. But there are no extras. All what is happening in that moment is really happening. I think why this is working, or why this is functioning, has to do with the fact that the guy who is animating the debate is a bad guy. He is part of this powerful people in the city who wants to cover up the scandal, or who wants to put it aside. And he listens to the speech Stockmann is giving, and then he asks the audience who agrees with Dr. Stockmann, and everywhere we go, the majority agrees. But the text we're listening to is a radical critique of Western societies. It's a text written by a French committee of anarchists, Comité Invisible, living in Tarnac. Some people might know. It was a big scandal because they were put into prison after some attacks on railway linked to nuclear transport on the railway in France. But that's another story. And they published this text in 2007, and it's called The Upcoming Insurrection, L'insurrection qui vient. And it was a text which was very important to the left or the radical left in Germany. And this text is very critical with our representative democracy, with our liberal bourgeois society, And nevertheless, a lot of people raise their arm and say, I do agree. And then this character plays as if he was under shock. How can you agree with this thinking? And this provokes really a moment where the audience members have to respond. I think that's the reason for why this moment is working. For me, it wasn't necessarily a decision when I decided to do it that way. It wasn't necessarily the reason that I wanted to have a political debate or something like that. For me, it was more that I wanted to have a moment in the show which I cannot control. So I wanted to have, it was also a question of courage, because one could say that my shows are very much directed in the sense of timing and rhythm and how they are constructed. So for myself, it was really a question of to have the courage to let go and not direct what's happening there. Yeah, that's how it came, and since I didn't do it again, because it would feel like as if I wanted to repeat something which really worked out very well, and for a lot of people who saw the show, this is really the moment which is the most leaves the biggest impression on them.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about this Dr. Stockmann and arriving at this view of him? He's, you know, a singer in an indie garage band of his own design. He's got sort of elements that seem to be drawn from precisely the sort of population that is brought up for serious question about their rigor. How did you land on him exactly, or on this draft?
There's a nice quote by Henrik Ibsen where he says himself, writing plays or writing drama is, now I'm lacking a translation here, maybe somebody could help me if there are people from the German department. Gerichtstag über mich selber sitzen, so being a judge on my own destiny, I would say. That's how he considered himself when he's writing a play. So it's trying to be a very severe judge on himself, on his own life, and I like that. I'm trying myself to do this when I'm working on a play, and the group of people, the friends of Dr. Stockmann in the play, and he himself, are all people which you could meet at my place if you were in my apartment in Berlin. So it's really very close to my own scene of people where I'm living, and so I wanted to talk about this. I wanted to talk about my own contradictions of getting involved, being politically active, of having the feeling maybe it's not enough. Institutions are corrupting myself. I'm too much in the establishment. I'm not anymore outside enough to have a critical view on the world I'm living in and I'm working in. But that's why this character is the character he is in my version.
Can you speak a little bit about your views on contemporizing work? That there's certainly been a fair amount of discussion around why masterpieces, you know, of literature and of the theater cross generations and continue to live. One could argue that with Beethoven or with Shakespeare or any of these kinds of works, that it's because there's a combination of formalism and a sort of unutterable mystery that goes along with it, that allows those works to withstand centuries of inquiry and continue to deliver new discovery in that same vehicle. And I think there's, a sense where even with your work in Shakespeare, that you have come forward saying every generation should reconsider its own Shakespeare. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the view of contemporizing and how that fits into your aesthetic and your standpoint on theater making.
I said every generation has its own Hamlet. And there are proofs in the history of theater that, of course, it's different if in Germany, in German history, if you put Hamlet on stage in the 30s when the Nazis are coming into power, if you do it in 42 at the Schauspielhaus am Gendarmenmarkt in Berlin with Gustav Gründgens, or if you do it after the war, or if you do it in the 60s, it will be always a different context, which creates then a different play. I mean, we could talk about Hamlet now for hours, maybe. There was a time when the Germans considered Hamlet a German play in the 19th century. They were saying that Hamlet is Germany. The spirit of Hamlet, the romantic prince who is not courageous enough to take a decision, that's Germany, because it's not unifying as a nation. They're not courageous enough, like the French were, to make revolution. They're always in doubt. When I did my version of Hamlet, there was famous German sociologue Ulrich Becker who was talking about the generation between 20 and 30 and calling this generation the Hamlet generation, because they didn't make up their mind what they want to do with their life. They had the feeling that something is rotten in the world they live in, but they didn't know what, and they didn't know how to change it. So you see, it will always be a different play. But Shakespeare is, of course, very different to Ibsen in my reading. Because when I'm doing Shakespeare, I just did Twelfth Night at Comédie Française in France, that just premiered 2 weeks ago. The experience when directing Shakespeare for me is that every day I'm going into a rehearsal space and I'm looking on a scene for a second time, third time, fourth time. It will be each time a different scene. Every time I'm really discovering something completely new, which I didn't know when I was working on the same scene the day before and the day before. That is, of course, very rewarding for a director, and that's maybe the reason for why I could imagine a life as a director where I would only do Shakespeare and nothing else. But that is specific to Shakespeare. When you do other, like Ibsen, which I did mostly, it's more about, okay, I understand the dialogue, I understand what the scene is about, maybe there's some adjustments to my first reading, but it more or less stays the same, and then you have to deal with how good or bad the actor is solving what is demanded or required in the writing of the scene. So as he can be considered like the model of writing a drama in the 20th century, so all the big American writers, playwrights, were referring to Ibsen. The first half of the 20th century, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams,
yes, yeah.
Eugene O'Neill, for them it was like the model of how a modern play should be written. And I think even one could say that the film script writing is very much inspired by what Ibsen did in the end of the 19th century. So what you can do here is to take what I did with Enemy of the People, for example, to take the bones of the play and then tell your own story, tell the story you want to tell. At a certain moment, when I started working on Ibsen, the first production was in 2002, which was Doll's House. I said in some interviews that Ibsen is for me like, or a play by Ibsen is for me like a Trojan horse, because the people, when they read The Doll's House by Ibsen, they come because they expect to see a classical bourgeois chamber play, where they can identify with the characters. But then inside the Trojan horse, there is a story, in the best case, there would be a story about themselves in the now and today. And that's what I'm doing with Ibsen, but I'm not doing this so much with Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is more complex, is more profound, more difficult, and more resisting to this kind of modeling the material. And there's less need to do it because it's so it's so complex and so beautiful in its complexity.
What do you feel, staying on the Shakespeare track for a moment, what do you feel most powerfully changes when the actual performance of the poetry itself, or the actual use of the language itself as it was conceived, is no longer a part of how the play will act on the listener and on the viewer?
You mean when you do a Shakespeare play in a translation? First of all, it's a big loss, because a lot of what's happening in the poetry of Shakespeare is you cannot translate. The beginning of Hamlet, when Claudius says, "What about you, Hamlet, my nephew and my son?" and his response is, "I'm too much in the sun." There's no, I'm too much in the sun, meaning maybe I was too long in the sun and my brain has a problem. I'm too much your son, I don't want to be, I'm your nephew, I don't want to be the son of the new king. I'm too much in the sun, I'm too close to the sun, which is the king, represented by the sun. Or the sun representing the king. You cannot translate this into any language. So there will always be a big loss. Even more, or what is even more difficult is that the English language has less syllables than French or German, for example. So if you respect the blank verse and you want to translate it into a language which has more syllables, you will have serious difficulties, and you will always end up with strange sentences which sound odd and you don't understand, where the translator tries to respect the verse and deliver the content, which is not really possible. So when I'm working with, I'm always, when I'm working on a Shakespeare, if it is in France or in German, I'm working with a writer who does a new translation, and I'm always asking for prose translations.
Yeah.
Because my experience as a theater goer when I was younger and going to a Shakespeare show was always I did not understand what they were talking about. It was just historical costumes and actors speaking in a strange way about things I can't follow. So what I'm trying to do is really, first of all, to make understand what the dialogue is about and what the conflict of the characters is about. I know that a lot of English directors or directors from English-speaking countries do envy international directors who can work on a Shakespeare text translated, because they consider that an advantage, because they do believe we are more free and we can write a contemporized version of Shakespeare. That is maybe true, but at the same time I envy them because they can do it in English with all the beauty of the language and of Shakespeare's writing.
Certainly the implications of the poetry are have been for ages the cornerstone of directors' ways into the scripts, every bit as much as the story has been. Would you speak a little bit about your working process with those writers who have sat with you on either on the Ibsen or on Shakespeare, and how you've arrived at the product that you've arrived at?
Well, usually I do when I do a version of an Ibsen play. For example, now I'm in 1.5 years probably I will do a version of a Wild Duck. So I'm starting now to work on the text with the dramaturg or with the writer, and that is really like 3-4 weeks every day, 8 hours, and rewriting the play.
That's a
They were like really every sentence to find what it's about, how could it sound today, and also some changes in order for the Wild Duck, for example. I mean, I haven't started to work on it, but it's very there's a lot of dust on the situations and the dialogues. So there will be a lot of work, but still the constellation of the characters is very interesting.
Oh yeah.
Very, very strong situation.
By the time
you're right. Sorry. And the question, and that is so interesting because I was speaking about the phenomenon of truth in the context of Enemy of the People, because with Wild Duck, I do believe Ibsen wrote a play where he says, well, maybe there are situations in our lives where the truth is destroying the life of other people. And that is, for me, very interesting, having done Enemy of the People, and then looking on a play of the same writer who actually is in contradiction, in a way,
of course,
with Enemy of the People.
I'm going to want to open this up for some questions. Before we do, I wonder if you would just quickly, if we can, talk a little bit about the work that you've also done with very contemporary writers. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about Didier Eribon and his wonderful memoir and some of the differences that came up for you there in working, with a living writer, contemporary prose, and a memoir, and the choices that came into play in the mounting of that work.
Well, I think the challenge of the book of Didier Eribon is not in the fact that it's a contemporary drama or contemporary play, but it's a philosophical, sociological, autobiographical, political novel.
Yeah.
So it's not at all drama, it's prose. And the challenge was how to put this on stage if you feel the need to put it on stage. And for me it was when I read it 2 years ago, and it was really eye-opening. Not only because it gives an explanation to the rise of populism and right-wing in the world, but also because it talks about himself and his family background, where he grew up in a very poor working class milieu. I'm sharing this with my own biography, and so that was also for me very touching to have this feeling. There's another artist, intellectual writer who has similar problems. When you come from this background and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the middle of academic or bourgeois establishment, and some of the rules or conventions you didn't learn in the past where you grew up. You're not part of this world, but you are kind of adopted by this world. That's what the book is also talking about. It's not only a book about the political disaster and the failure of the left, because this is his explanation.
Yeah.
And it's also a book about being a gay man and being raised in a time where homophobia was even stronger than it is today. So that it's a variety of subjects in this book. And the answer or the way I found to put this on stage is not necessarily something which you can adapt on each and every book, but it's what I thought it could be. So what I did was I was shooting a movie with Didier. So I did this Returning to Reims. The book is called Returning to Reims because after the death of his father, which was a very violent alcoholic father, he didn't want to talk to anymore, and he did not talk to for 20 years. Mm-hmm. So when he died and he didn't want to go to his funeral, he goes back to Reims to meet his mother, and he starts to talk with his mother. And his family was for generations communist and voting for the Communist Party, French Communist Party. And when he starts to talk with his mother, he finds out that she and the rest of the family are now voting for Front National, which is the extreme right by Marine Le Pen. And he asks himself, how is this possible? And so what I did was, with my video artist and filmmaker Sébastien Dupouet, who is French, we reenacted this journey, but with Didier and his mother and all the rest. So we did this journey, but with a camera, and we sat with his mother at home, and they were looking at the photos and drinking coffee and chatting. And the play is that the set is a studio where you do the voiceover for the movie, and you see Nina Hoss, the actress, who is doing the voiceover and reading on this documentary the original text of the book of Didier, but comes a point in the show where she does not agree with the choices the director made. The director is also on stage, and they start to argue on how you in these days you should do engaged art, and how you can or how you can't be an artist who cares not only about his career but also about the world, who's going more and more into the wrong direction, and is there any ways and means, are there any ways and means to have an influence on how politics are developing?
It struck me that there was such an incredible alignment, even though that piece could not be more different in some ways than in its origins than Ibsen or than Shakespeare. That interestingly, of the works of yours that I've seen, the alignment around that, particularly with that text, was incredibly telling. That it really does fit into this sort of arc of work.
I did another French book in June. I'm only mentioning this because I know that my friend is coming to Berkeley on Wednesday, Edouard Louise, and I did a book by Edouard in June, History of Violence. He's a young writer, 25 years old, and he wrote this book when he was 22, and he is a student of Didier Eribon. And great guy, so you should all go and
go to the lecture.
See what he's talking about his book on Wednesday here at Berkeley.
I wanted you to talk a bit about Returning to Reims, and mostly because we, of course, after introducing Enemy of the People, we hope to bring that production here as soon as we can. It is just staggeringly moving and incredibly hypnotic and beautiful, and we would love to bring that here as well. So I hope we've laid a little fertile ground for that in the future. With the moments we have left, I'd love to open for some questions if you're willing.
Sure.
Okay, let's start back here.
Hey, thank you so much for coming to share your process with us. I read about the experience your production of Enemy of the People had in China about a month ago, and I just wanted to hear more about your experience there and your reaction to that. It's really something, considering it's exactly 100 years ago that it was translated into Chinese, and Ibsen was hugely popular and influential in that day. So.
Well, the problem wasn't Ibsen.
I didn't mean to imply that it was.
The problem wasn't Ibsen. We are touring in China for some years now, and we really like Chinese audience. And unfortunately, I have the feeling since this event, we will not go back to China because we will not be invited anymore. We were, for years, after having brought Hedda Gabler, Hamlet, Richard III, The Marriage of Maria Braun, and other productions of our theater, there were always people interested in an Enemy of the People in different cities around China, and but they always said, it's too dangerous, we cannot bring it, China is not ready. Then all of a sudden we get this invitation by NCPA, which is National Center for Performing Arts in Beijing, 200 meters off Tiananmen Square. So it's right around the corner, and it's like the cultural palace of the Communist Party of China. So we thought, okay, now this is the official invitation by the rulers of this country, and they want to show themselves tolerant and liberal, and they invite us to show how open they can be. That was our reading of the event. When we performed and when we understood after the show that they were terrified, we found out, or our reading of it was, they didn't know what they were invited. So it was really a big mistake on a lower level of administration. And what happened in this moment of audience participation was that all of a sudden audience members were talking about the freedom of speech in China, freedom of the individual in China, corruption in China, ecological scandals in China, and the authorities of the theater were going mad, and they were afraid. It was very dangerous for them. What happened then was that overnight there was a lot of response in the social medias about the show. Immediately the theater stopped selling tickets after the show, after the first show. Overnight they were deleting everything what was happening in social medias. And they were sitting with us till 5 o'clock in the morning discussing what we can do now. They told us it's not possible that this moment of audience participation happens a second time. Then we were talking to a lot of Chinese friends, but also people from Goethe Institute in Beijing, what we should do now. And it was also the question of, okay, if we stop performing now, it would not make any difference in China, because there would have been one show, nothing on internet, and just the second and third show, out of technical reasons, didn't happen. So we decided to do the second and third show, and to react with a theatrical moment, meaning that at the moment where the discussion starts, he says, well, usually there would have been a discussion now, but our character lost his voice. He cannot speak anymore. Do you know this? Is this familiar to you? And then there was a moment of 1 minute of silence, and all the actors were coming up front and watching the audience. That was even worse. The audience understood that the show was censored, and they were again speaking up. There were again shouts of freedom of the individual, freedom of speech in China, and then because we were not only supposed to perform in Beijing but also in Nanjing, they cancelled the shows. But again, they didn't say because of political reasons. It was so ridiculous because they told us, we are so sorry, we have technical issues. And then we said, okay, can you show it to us? And they showed us the theater, and it was just a simple, because they had this part of the stage which you can move, like everywhere in the world you can move the stage. And they said, yeah, we moved it, and you see, you cannot put your stage because it was like this, it's chaos. Yeah, but we can fix it. We can bring it up again. No, it's not working. We don't know why. Some manipulation, and it was very important. Well, you might know that it's very important in China. It's part of the culture not to lose your face. So it was very important for them to find a solution where they don't lose their face. But there were some things, because we're trying to do a movie, documentary, which is called Mapping Democracy. We are following most of the tours with a camera team and filming the moment of audience interaction, and which we did also in Beijing. But what happened then is that the authorities confiscated the film, but not only to delete it, but to look at the footage and to see who was speaking up. And that moment it wasn't funny at all anymore. You know? And I'm afraid that the people who invited us probably lost their jobs. You know? So it was very, very sad experience we had.
Another question.
I just was wondering if you could point to something that those of us who are going to see the production this weekend could look out for. Maybe a decision you made where you changed something. Or...
For tonight?
Tonight, yeah.
Yeah, I did change something, but I will not mention.
We don't have to give anything away.
No. I mean, yeah, the president of this country was talking about enemies of the people quite often. So he did a lot of advertising for the show. There's no need to change anything.
So I guess it's going to be running for a couple more years. All right. Well, join me in thanking Thomas.